Hello everyone, thank you for joining me this evening. And since it is almost Christmas, I wanted to touch also on this topic in Swamiji's life. His first Christmas with his guru in his guru's ashram at Mount Washington in Los Angeles. And Swamiji until then was familiar only with how the established churches presented the teachings of Christ, and which was either in a superficial way that Christ was some kind of social reformer, or in a way that was very sectarian and narrow and dogmatic. And it took a yogi from India, Yogananda ji, to teach him the true inner teachings of Christ, how these teachings were very mystical, that he taught a path of inner renunciation. And let me share a little bit about Swamiji's first Christmas with his guru. Christmas was an important holiday at Mount Washington, the most sacred of the entire year. Master had divided it into its two basic aspects: spiritual Christmas, which we celebrated on Christmas Eve, and social Christmas, celebrated the following day with traditional present opening and a banquet. Master later shifted our spiritual Christmas back to the 23rd so that devotees wouldn't have to stay up all night afterwards preparing food for the large Christmas Day banquet. On the 24th, we gathered in the chapel at 10 in the morning for an all-day meditation. I don't know how many have approached their first experience of this long meditation without trepidation. One chant we sang that day was "Cloud-colored Christ, come." I found it marvelously effective for taking me deep into meditation. At some time during that afternoon, Master had a vision of the Divine Mother. In an ecstatic state, he related her wishes to many of those present. Some he told to give themselves unreservedly to God. Others he informed that the Cosmic Mother had blessed them specially. And then he spoke to her directly, out loud, that we might hear at least one side of this blissful dialogue. "Oh, you are so beautiful," he repeated over and over. "Don't go," he cried at last. "You say the material desires of these people are driving you away. Oh, come back. Please don't go." The meditation that day was so deep that the customary 10-minute recess halfway through was omitted. The apprehension I had felt at the onset proved a delusion. The soul loves to meditate, Master used to tell us. It is the ego in its attachment to body consciousness that resists entering the inner vastness. And then on Christmas Day, had for its main feature an afternoon banquet at which Master presided. I helped to serve the curry dinner. Afterwards, Master addressed us. The sweetness of his speech so uplifted me that to me it was as though I were living in heaven. Never had I thought such divine inspiration possible on this prosaic earth. The day after Christmas, Master gave Kriya initiation. Toward the end of the initiation ceremony, Master said these thrilling words of promise. Of those present, there will be a few siddhas and quite a few jivan muktas. It was some 24 years after this Christmas that I had my first Christmas at Ananda Village in California. I had come to live at Ananda that year, 1972, at the end of August. And for several months, I spent absorbing new teachings, the teachings of the energization exercises, of yoga philosophy, learning and absorbing, going deeper into my meditation, into my hatha yoga. And Swamiji was my main teacher in those months. And every Sunday he would give a inspiring satsang. And often on Sunday afternoon or on Saturday he would give a class, or perhaps an informal questions and answers over tea at his home. And every Thursday evening would be a satsang just for the residents of the village. And I lived at what we called our meditation retreat, and it was the spiritual heart of the village. It was about 5 miles away from another piece of property where we started our schools, where our businesses and farm and families lived. And I would go to work during the day, but every morning, every evening, and the weekends I would spend in spiritual pursuit. And every day we would have group meditations. And I too understood the deeper teachings of Christ only through Guruji and only through Swamiji, and how they presented these mystical teachings. And my mother was a spiritual person by nature, but she was born in Ireland at the time of the Irish Civil War, and she saw such hatred, sort of a blind hatred that the Catholics and the Protestants had toward each other, even children. And she vowed not to raise her 4 children in either of those churches, but to leave it up to us when we became adults to follow our own inner calling. And I was very grateful for that freedom that she gave me. And growing up, I ended up rejecting the dogma of both churches, even though I knew that the teachings of Christ had a power, but I had no idea how to access that power until I discovered this spiritual path. And when I arrived at the village the year that I arrived at Christmas, Swamiji was not there for the first time. And he was here in India. And you may know that he lived here for 4 years, from 1958 to 1962, serving his guru's organization, traveling and lecturing, and he became very popular with many students. And then, as often happens in his guru's organization, he was on the board of directors, he was a vice president, but due to politics and jealousy, the other directors asked him to eventually leave the organization in 1962. And for years, he tried to return. He was told not to have any contact with his former students. And for years, he tried to return to India to live a quiet life of a yogi. But there was even rumors that got into the Indian government, false rumors that Swamiji was a CIA agent. And the government refused him a visa to return to India for 10 years. And then finally he was given permission to come to Delhi to plead his case in person. So this was his first visit to India, was in that year. And he had reunions with many old friends, and he also sought out the darshan of many saints. Every week he would send a letter back to all of us, and we especially awaited his visit with Anandamoy Ma, the saint that he wished to be with the most. And Ma had a particular affection for Swamiji. Starting with I'm reading now from Swami Kriyananda, Light Bearer, just a couple of sentences. Starting with their first meeting in February 1959, Ma always showed a special affection for Swamiji. She told him, "Many thousands have come to this body. None have attracted me as you have." On another occasion, she said, "There are people who have been with me for 25 years and more, but they haven't taken from me what you have." To others, she said, "Here is a lotus in a pond. Many frogs sit under the lotus, croaking. Then a bee flies in, takes the honey, and flies away. Kriyananda is that bee." And back to that Christmas, for me, we also had a long all-day meditation. Swamiji continued this tradition of his guru. And it was an eye-opener to me how much I enjoyed those 8 hours. I survived and I loved it. And particularly the music, I found that with a meditative mind, I could absorb the vibration of the beautiful music in an entirely new way, and it brought me deeper. And until this time, I was living at the meditation retreat, first in a tent, and then as the weather started to get colder, in a very primitive, clear plastic shelter. I should say I wasn't living there. I was really only sleeping there. We even had a couple of snowfalls in that time. And there was a couple of common buildings. There was a temple where we had all of our meditations and sadhana. And then there was a dining room, a common room. And every evening we would have dinner, and then all of the staff would go home. But then 2 or 3 of us would remain, reading, being close to the fire. And we were the ones who lived in these primitive shelters. And finally at bedtime, we would leave the fire to go to our little shelters. And so I was particularly happy when at Christmas time, I was invited by a family who had a wooden cabin there with a good heater and a little kitchen area. They were leaving. They were going for 3 weeks to spend Christmas holidays with relatives, and they invited me to stay in this cabin. And I also learned during this time there how important it had been for me, and still is, to take some time away from my daily schedule, take some time in seclusion where I could focus more on contemplation, focus more on my meditation. Somehow, for me, I needed to remove myself from the environment of my work to really focus in that way. And I had done this a year before that, before I decided to leave Canada and go to California, searching for a spiritual community, and I think to get clear in my direction, to make a clear decision, I think also to build up courage. I spent 4 days on an isolated beach in Canada. I was camping, and you could reach this beach only at low tide, and so no one came to that beach because they didn't even know about it. And also taking seclusion at this time, right after Christmas, for some days. During that time alone, I gained even stronger the desire to join the monastery, which had developed around Swamiji and his home about a year before this. And I wrote to Swamiji in India and told him of my desire. And he respected it. And he said, let's talk in person when I return in March. That was much later than Swamiji intended to return. But the wait here in Delhi in order to see the proper government officials about his visa took much longer than he expected, and he received that visa, and he was able to return once more to India and has done so many times since then. And when Swamiji returned in March, I certainly did speak with him, and soon afterwards shifted to the monastery. And that shift, you might be interested to know, also meant a much more comfortable, slightly more comfortable housing for me. And so I just wanted to share these memories and some of the lessons that I learned, some of the lessons that Swamiji learned with his guru at this time of spiritual Christmas. And so thank you so much for being with me this evening, and look forward to sharing again next week at this time. Joy to you.